The island of Newfoundland keeps its secrets close, shrouds them in mystery. But once in a while, the fog is lifted, the truth comes out.
I get a feeling there's something going on here. My whole body was shaking.
You go to bed believing that you're a certain person one night, and then all of a sudden the next day, everything that you've known is not true.
This is not the life that I should have lived.
I'm Luke Quinton from CBC. This is Come By Chance, available now.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
We're getting really used to species vanishing. If not to total extinction, then to a slow dwindling, region by region, pushed out by hunters, by pollution, by a changing climate that doesn't change back. It happens to the smallest of insects and to the largest, most iconic species we know. And mostly, we try to save what we can, but our efforts are often in vain. Success stories do exist. They are just few and far between. This is one of them, and this is what it can teach us about creating others. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Emma McIntosh is an Ontario reporter for the Narwhal, one of our favorite guests, and, importantly for this story, an avid birder. Hey, Emma.
Hey, good to be here.
It's not often we get to talk to you about something so positive.
No, I'm always here talking about scandals and drama. This is so much better.
Tell us about the sad beginning to this story, at least. When did bald eagles, the most majestic probably of American birds, become threatened for the first time?
So the first time this happened, it was really around the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s. And that's because people just loved hunting them. I think in some places they were seen as menaces. In some places there were actually bounties for killing them. I think people, especially settlers, really overhunted them for their feathers. And so that was a pretty bad time. Eagles were rapidly declining. And because they have this iconic status in culture in North America, not just for settlers, but also for a lot of First Nations and Native American tribes, regulators took action on it. And there were all these measures that they put in, including this big migratory birds treaty that for a little while helped stop the birds' population from collapsing.
For a little while, because when was it? The 1960s? Explain what happened, I guess, the second time they were pushed to the brink.
Yeah, we really didn't learn our lesson the first time from that one. And so by the 1960s, they had almost died out again, like even more severely, because of widespread use of a pesticide. I'm not going to try to pronounce the full chemical name. You probably know this chemical as DDT.
Right.
And especially if you grew up in the 60s and the 70s, you probably remember it. I've talked to my mom about it, and she remembers playing in the mist of the DDT truck as it drove through her neighborhood growing up in Ontario. And DDT was actually a really miraculous pesticide. It was one of the major reasons why malaria became much less of a problem in the developed world. The guy who invented it actually won like a Nobel Prize for it.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is that it's too good at killing stuff. And it also is really, really good at sticking around in the ecosystem. And so by 1960, it was really prevalent in like everything, and especially in the fish that eagles would eat.
What is it that's so harmful to them? Or is it just basically the same thing that makes it harmful to us and insects and everything else it touches?
It's the same thing, but, eagles are a little smaller than we are, so they're a little more sensitive. Originally, we thought it was probably fine for people. It was not, but anyway. Bald eagles, what happened to them was actually really, really sad. Not only would immediate exposure to high levels of it just, kill them, but over time, as it accumulated in their bodies, it would harm their reproductive systems. And most heartbreakingly, it would make the shells of their eggs really, really weak. And so when like the parent eagles would try to sit on their eggs to incubate them, the shells would just crack and the chicks would die and never hatch, which was just like devastating. And so, at one point, there were just a handful of breeding pairs left on the Great Lakes. Like whole generations of people just never saw them here when they used to be super, super common.
When I grew up, bald eagles were exclusively a thing like of the West Coast and out in the mountains.
Yeah, totally. And like, if you are listening to this from the West Coast right now, you're probably going, eagles? Ever? We're a low population? Like,
right.
Those guys are pretty much public menaces out west. But it's because around the Great Lakes, especially like Toronto, Hamilton, Niagara, these really populated regions, were just more populated. So there was more use of DDT here.
So DDT was banned, not specifically because of eagles, but because, to your point, it's really good at killing things. When did that happen? And as low as their numbers were, how quickly have they bounced back?
Yeah, so the movement to ban them really started in the 60s. And I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the public awareness around this was because of an American biologist named Rachel Carson. She wrote this iconic book, Silent Spring, that documented how pesticides were killing birds and people and offered all these grim predictions. So the name comes from like the idea that there would be no birds, so spring would have no birdsong. And this was like a massive bestseller. It sparked all this public concern, but it still took 10 years for what eventually became the modern environmental movement to push politicians to start making change. So Canada eventually phased it out for the most part in the 70s and then banned it entirely after 1990. And what that meant was basically that there was a whole group of people invested in this who had to make sure that the bald eagles that we had could survive long enough so that DDT could degrade in the ecosystem and then they could eventually reproduce normally. But they really didn't have many left, mostly around Lake Erie or like the upper Great Lakes. And so it was a really perilous time for the species, but slowly but surely with a lot of intervention from people, honestly, and a lot of dedicated volunteers who tracked them.
Right. Tell me more about that intervention, because this is kind of the crux of what you wrote about for the narwhal. And when the population numbers are so low and it's going to take so long for the population to potentially blossom, what kinds of stuff had to happen to make sure they stayed alive?
Basically, scientists needed to know where pretty much every single adult bald eagle around the Southern Great Lakes was and make sure that when they were here, when they were nesting, that they were protected. And so there was a whole network of volunteers who kept an eye on them. I talked to one guy named Jody Allaire who works for Birds Canada. And in the 2000s to like the early 2010s, it was his job to attach trackers to these bald eagles. So he would literally be holding them in his hand and catching them to attach trackers so that they knew exactly where they were. And he knew them all by name. In one case, Jody found an injured adult eagle in Port Dover, Ontario, and actually drove it to the hospital himself, drove it for hours in his car, and just had her in the passenger seat to make sure that she would survive because it was that perilous. And yeah, now we're here. And just last year, bald eagles were removed from Ontario's endangered species list, which is, I believe, the last place in Canada where they were endangered.
What does that mean to be removed from the species list? I mean, obviously, it's kind of self-evident, but in terms of like numbers of population or just, how common they've become now?
I think the biggest indicator of this is just that all over the province, people are seeing them for the first time in their lifetime. I talked to one person in Peterborough who's like a self-professed eagle enthusiast and has spent her life looking for them and has never seen them until recently. Where I go on Lake Huron in the summer, I had never seen a bald eagle my entire life until a couple of years ago when all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of them.
Tell me about that. I know you are an avid birder. So tell me just about seeing this particular bird that has all this symbolism attached to it for the first time.
I mean, it's pretty exciting. These things are huge. And especially when you have an adult one with that iconic white head, it's unmistakable, right? You know what you're looking at. But I think the first time it happened for me, I definitely swore a bunch. I was like, am I hallucinating? Because I didn't even know that they could live on the Great Lakes, right? And I think that's an experience a lot of people are having. especially in Toronto. I mean, earlier this year, the first pair of bald eagles to nest in the city in, over 100 years.
Oh, wow.
Just did. And they're now looking after a couple of bald eagle chicks, which is really a sign of how far we've come. Of course, it's not the same as it was before European settlement of this continent, but it really shows what needs to happen on what scale to bring a species back from the brink.
I remember seeing stories about the bald eagle couple nesting in Toronto, and those stories making it very clear that they would not divulge the location of the nest for fear of disturbing these birds. So that's kind of where we're still at, right?
That's right. And I think that's actually a really important point, is that we don't get to just now say woo, we did it.
Right.
Because so many of the longer term problems that we have in our society, climate change and contaminants, just as 2 examples of the things that are harming our environment, could still hurt bald eagles. If we don't get it together here and learn this lesson for real, we're just going to be back in the same place with them, in a couple decades from now. And so that was kind of really why I wanted to write this story, is to say hey, did we really learn from this? Did we learn the core lesson? Are we prepared to take these lessons into the future so that we don't end up in the same situation again and again and again?
When we talk about their recovery, I mean, obviously the hardworking volunteers that made it happen by watching them when they were on the verge of extinction, at least here. But what about, the policy more generally? What does their recovery say broadly about chemical contamination in Ontario and what kind of handle we have on it?
Well, I think that we've learned that we can get a handle on it if we really, really try. And that means a long-term, multi-part strategy that really relies on politicians at the end of the day being willing to take action. Look, people and advocates worked for 10 years to raise awareness, to get politicians to act. And once they did, the birds came back. The stewarding from volunteers was amazing, but ultimately, none of this would have happened if DDT was not phased out and gone. Not fully gone because it persists in our ecosystem,
right,
but not more of it being pumped into our waterways and onto our land, right? And it was a really similar story in the end to what's happening now with climate change in a lot of ways, Rachel Carson, that scientist who first documented and pointed out the issues with DDT, industry went after her and attacked her personally. There were, huge lobbying pushes to convince politicians not to act on this. And in the end, they did it anyway. And if that sounds familiar, my colleague in Ottawa, Carl Meyer, his whole beat is reporting on, lobbying blitzes from industry to prevent efforts to mitigate climate change. And another thing is that, this really worked because it was a whole bunch of people working together, not just scientists, not just climate advocates, the same people you'd expect, but also ordinary people who read Silent Spring and decided to care. Also, hunters got involved because they realized that DDT was killing birds that they wanted to hunt, and so it's a good example of how we need a broad coalition of people if we're really going to stop the decline of species, if we're really going to make long-term changes.
What are some of those long-term changes that we need to make now? The whole specter of climate change accepted, maybe, but in terms of contaminants that are affecting wildlife in Ontario now and what we need to make sure that these bald eagles stick around, but more broadly that other species that are or have been close to the brink can bounce back.
I'm really glad that you asked that, because I think with climate change, it's obviously a more complex set of problems, and it's a huger set of issues and causes and harm. But in a broad sense, we just need to cut emissions. I think that's the consensus that we're hearing from scientists all over the world. It's just that we need to stop emitting carbon. We need to stop emitting methane. And we also need to be really careful about what we're putting into our ecosystems. The Narwhal has published a bunch of stories about a chemical called PFAS that has been put into Lake Nipissing in Ontario. That's another example of a chemical like DDT, where the effects of it on human health were not studied before entering widespread use, right?
Right.
And so we have to learn these lessons for the long term. We have to know what we're putting into our ecosystem. And the consequences of that, are stark. It's not just eagles. There was this landmark study in 2019 that found that wild bird populations across North America have dropped by a third over 50 years. So in the time since DDT was banned. And that's not just eagles, it's common backyard birds like the robins that you hear singing on spring mornings, or blue jays if you're in Toronto. So it's not like this dramatic, quick decline, but it's happening slowly. And we have to realize that birds are an indicator species. And so they experience the same problems that we do, just faster. They're kind of the canary in the coal mine for everything. So what happens to them has big implications for what happens to us.
And I mean, if nothing else, the fact that you can look around and see bald eagles around the Great Lakes now tells you that this kind of stuff is possible, right? That's at the heart of the story.
Exactly. And that's the thing that people forget. You know, there's a lot of defeatism and we can't do this, but we've already done it. So we just have to remember that and remember how we did it.
Emma, thank you, as always, for telling us this and for telling us how, in fact, we did do it.
Hey, thanks for having me. Always stoked to talk about eagles.
Emma McIntosh, Ontario reporter for the Narwhal. That was the big story. For more from us, including all sorts of appearances from Emma McIntosh, especially the 3-part series she hosted called Pay Dirt on Ontario's Greenbelt scandal, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also shoot us some feedback with an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or a voicemail by calling 416-935-5935. Joseph Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is a producer on the show. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Sound design this week was done by Christy Chan and Mark Angley. Diana Kay is our manager of business development, and I am your host and your executive producer, Jordan Heath-Rawlings. That makes us the Frequency Podcast Network, which is a division of Rogers. Thanks for listening. We've got a couple of things in the feed for you this weekend, as usual, and we'll be back with a fresh Big Story on Monday.